So, before the Jeep became the most recognized vehicle of World War II, there was a moment when the U.S. Army realized it had a massive problem. The world was shifting into full-scale war, and armies still depended on horses, bicycles, and slow, unreliable trucks that couldn't keep up with the pace of modern combat. American forces were expanding so fast that commanders were repeatedly sending reports saying they had no quick, adaptable vehicle for scouting, transporting officers, carrying messages, or moving small teams across rough terrain. They needed something compact, something fast, something tough enough to handle deserts, jungles, mountains, anywhere the war would take them. And they needed it immediately. That urgency kicked off one of the most intense design races in military history. Multiple small American companies were called to submit prototypes almost overnight. Bantam stepped forward first, a tiny manufacturer that somehow managed to design and deliver a working vehicle in just 49 days. Engineers worked non-stop, sometimes sleeping at the factory, just to meet the Army's impossible deadline. When Bantam rolled in with that first prototype, the Bantam reconnaissance car, it impressed almost everyone. But the Army doubted whether a small company could mass-produce thousands of units, and that hesitation opened the door for Willys Overland and Ford to enter the competition and refine the design further. As testing began, it became clear that one feature dominated all others, the Willys Go Devil engine. It had incredible torque, speed, and durability. During field trials, soldiers pushed the prototypes beyond normal limits. They drove them through mud pits, up rocky slopes, across rivers, through forests, and across open desert. They overloaded them with equipment. They ran them for hours and hours without stopping. Yet the little machine kept going. It climbed surfaces steeper than any truck could manage. It handled terrain that would destroy wooden-wheeled carts. It replaced motorcycles for dispatch riders. It could haul machine guns, tow small artillery, carry wounded soldiers, or serve as a command car. It didn't just perform well, it outperformed almost everything the Army had. This convinced the military that the design needed to be standardized and mass-produced. Willys and Ford were chosen to build the final versions, the Willys MB and the Ford GPW, and that's when production exploded. Assembly lines produced vehicles at a scale that shocked even the Axis powers. Crates were engineered so the Jeep could be shipped in pieces and assembled in the field in under an hour. It became the most widely used vehicle in the American arsenal, showing up in every theater of the war. And by the end of this first phase of its creation, it wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was becoming the backbone of American mobility, the little machine that would allow troops to move faster, supply more effectively, scout deeper, and coordinate more efficiently than any enemy expected. This is the foundation of why German soldiers later said it was the American machine they respected most. When the Jeep finally entered the battlefield, it didn't just fill a gap, it transformed the way American forces fought. The moment the first units rolled into North Africa in late 1942, soldiers immediately understood that this was not just a convenient transport, it was a force multiplier. Reconnaissance patrols, which used to move slowly on foot or rely on noisy motorcycles that attracted attention, suddenly had a quiet, fast, maneuverable vehicle that could slip through rough ground and return with intelligence in half the time. Commanders could move between units with an ease that seemed almost unfair compared to the cumbersome command cars of the Axis armies. It wasn't long before every platoon, every company, and every headquarters wanted Jeeps, and soon enough, they had them. As the fighting intensified across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and eventually into France, the Jeep became the ultimate improvisation machine. Soldiers strapped radios to the back and turned them into mobile communication hubs. Others removed the windshield, mounted machine guns, and used them as fast assault vehicles capable of delivering firepower exactly where it was needed. Medics converted them into miniature ambulances, racing wounded soldiers from the front lines to field hospitals over terrain where ordinary trucks would have bogged down. Engineers used them to carry tools, tow equipment, and scout unstable ground for minefields. It reached the point where American troops joked that the Jeep could do everything except fly, and even that wasn't entirely true, because the Army actually developed a glider version designed to be airdropped behind enemy lines. On the front lines, the Jeep's value became even more obvious. During rapid advances, especially after the breakout from Normandy, American forces were covering distances so quickly that traditional supply columns couldn't keep up. The Jeep fixed that problem. It darted between units, running ammunition, water, rations, spare parts, even replacement radio batteries, ensuring that frontline soldiers never went without essentials. The Germans noticed this immediately. They had seen mechanized warfare before, they had practically invented it, but they had never seen an army integrate one small vehicle into so many roles so effectively. The Jeep kept American formations constantly supplied, constantly linked, constantly mobile. Its impact on morale was impossible to ignore. Troops trusted it. It started in cold weather when other engines froze. It climbed muddy slopes when heavier trucks spun their wheels. It handled the rubble of bombed cities without missing a beat. It carried officers, machine gunners, chaplains, medics, scouts, artillery observers, everyone and everything. Soldiers decorated them with names, painted unit insignias, carried personal gear on the sides, and treated them almost like reliable members of the squad. By the time the campaigns pushed into Germany itself, the Jeep had become a symbol, one that represented speed, adaptability, and the relentless momentum of the American advance. Axis troops began to see it not as a simple vehicle but as a sign of how quickly American forces could recover, reorganize, and strike again. It wasn't the biggest machine, or the most powerful, but it was everywhere, doing everything, keeping the U.S. military one step ahead. And that was the true beginning of the respect it earned from the German side. As the war moved deeper into Europe, the Jeep's importance grew even more, because the terrain wasn't just open desert or rolling countryside anymore, it was forests, destroyed villages, flooded fields, cratered roads, steep hills, and endless mud. In every one of those environments, the Jeep proved it could go places that surprised even the men driving it. Infantry officers began using Jeeps to scout ahead of advancing units, weaving through narrow forest paths or rubble-filled alleys in bombed towns where larger vehicles simply couldn't fit. Many of the early pushes during the liberation of France and Belgium were led by small Jeep teams who raced ahead to identify roadblocks, enemy ambushes, and safe routes for tanks and armored columns to follow. The Jeep also became the backbone of coordination between the different branches of the American military. Artillery spotters rode in Jeeps, climbing hills and ridges to direct fire with incredible accuracy. Radio operators strapped large transmitters onto the back seats so they could maintain constant contact between advancing infantry and headquarters miles away. When weather-grounded aircraft, these mobile Jeep radio teams became the eyes and ears of entire divisions. American commanders depended on them, because a connected army was a fast army, and a fast army was an unstoppable one. As winter closed in, especially during the bitter fighting in the Ardennes, the Jeep proved its toughness in the cold. Freezing temperatures stalled tanks, jammed engines, and made movements painfully slow. But the Jeep kept running. Soldiers wrapped blankets around the hoods, lit small fires under the engine blocks, and coaxed them to life every morning because the Jeep was too important to lose, not just for mobility, but for survival. They used it to deliver warm food, carry firewood, retrieve wounded men from snowy ditches, and move ammunition to machine gun nests that would have been isolated without it. During the Battle of the Bulge, the speed at which American units could reposition themselves often depended entirely on whether their Jeeps survived the night. What truly impressed German officers during this period wasn't just the Jeep's performance but its reliability. While German vehicles often required specialized parts, delicate maintenance, and high-quality fuel, the Jeep thrived on basic upkeep and could run even on poor fuel. When German units captured Jeeps, they often kept them, maintained them, and used them until they broke down because they had no equivalent vehicle with the same mix of speed, strength, and simplicity. Reports from captured German soldiers sometimes mentioned that American mobility seemed limitless, and much of that impression came from the constant presence of Jeeps. By the end of 1944, the Jeep had become so deeply integrated into American operations that it changed how the Army planned battles. Commanders assumed they would always have rapid transport. They assumed couriers would reach them quickly. They assumed supplies could be moved at a moment's notice. This shifted the entire style of U.S. warfare into something far more dynamic and flexible. And all of this set the stage for why, when German officers later reflected on the war, they pointed not to American tanks or planes, but to this small, unassuming vehicle that held the entire machine together. By the time Allied forces pushed into Germany in 1945, the Jeep had become more than a battlefield tool, it had become the very language of American mobility. Everywhere the Germans looked, they saw the same pattern: American units that should have been exhausted kept moving, kept regrouping, kept reinforcing each other with stunning speed. At the center of that momentum was the Jeep. It wasn't the biggest vehicle, but it was the one always in motion, carrying officers who made fast decisions, scouts who probed ahead, engineers who cleared obstacles, and medics who pulled the wounded to safety. The German army, drained of fuel and reliant on vehicles that needed careful maintenance, watched as American Jeeps darted across terrain that their own transports would have never attempted. This period showed the Jeep not just as a transport vehicle, but as the backbone of American tactical agility. When bridges were blown, Jeeps went around the wreckage. When roads were mined, they slipped through forest paths or climbed embankments. They bypassed enemy strongpoints to deliver messages and coordinate flanking attacks. Many times, a single Jeep brought back reconnaissance that shifted entire divisional plans. Commanders trusted these small teams because they could go where maps ended and where armored vehicles became liabilities. They were fast, quiet, and able to retreat before being pinned down, which meant that the information they carried was often more accurate than what aircraft or long-range scouts could provide. The Jeep also became critical for civilian interactions as Allied forces liberated towns. It carried liaisons who organized food distribution, transported translators, and escorted displaced civilians to safety. Its presence became a sign that order was returning. In many liberated villages, children would run behind Jeeps, shouting for chocolate and gum, and soldiers joked that no other Allied vehicle created as much excitement. These soft moments stood in sharp contrast to the desperate final phase of the war, but they showed how deeply the Jeep had woven itself into every part of the campaign, military and humanitarian alike. In the final push toward Berlin, Jeeps operated almost like nervous systems for the advancing American formations. They carried wire teams laying communication lines behind armored columns. They rushed artillery observers into forward positions that gave the Allies devastating accuracy. They transported intelligence officers who gathered documents from abandoned German headquarters. Some even served as makeshift prisoner transport vehicles after towns surrendered. Every hour saved meant fewer casualties, and the Jeep saved countless hours simply by existing wherever it was needed. What struck many German officers was the sheer number of them. They captured 1, then 5, then 10, and realized the Americans weren't relying on a few specialized machines, they were relying on an entire philosophy of mobility. The Jeep embodied that philosophy: simple parts, easy repairs, low fuel consumption, and universal purpose. It was the opposite of German over-engineering. It didn't need perfection to work, it only needed fuel, a driver, and a reason to move. And in that final year of the war, it seemed like the Americans always had all three. By the time the war reached its final months, the Jeep had become so common, so essential, that American troops barely thought about how extraordinary it really was. But their enemies noticed. German officers, especially those captured in early 1945, often remarked that the speed at which American units shifted from defense to offense felt unreal. They described situations where they believed they had broken through a line or created a gap, only to find that within an hour, Jeeps were already moving in, carrying infantry officers, radio teams, and artillery observers who restored order and closed the weakness before German troops could exploit it. This agility frustrated them deeply because it erased the advantage of surprise, an advantage the German army had relied on since the early days of Blitzkrieg. The Jeep played a quiet but decisive role in counterblow after counterblow. When German armored groups tried sudden night attacks, it was Jeep-mounted scouts who detected the movements first, racing back to alert headquarters. When enemy units broke into American positions, jeeps carried reserve squads to plug the hole before it widened. When fog or bad weather grounded aircraft, jeeps provided the communication and mobility needed to guide reinforcements through unfamiliar terrain. Without these vehicles, the American response times would have been drastically slower, and many small German tactical victories could have turned into real disasters. The jeep also shaped how the Allies exploited breakthroughs. Once a German line collapsed, American armored forces surged forward, but tanks alone could not maintain that momentum. They needed reconnaissance. They needed fuel. They needed engineers, medics, wire-laying teams, signal units, and officers to coordinate everything. And all of those people moved in jeeps. In many battles, the fastest American element was not the tank spearhead but the jeeps racing ahead to secure crossroads, cut communication lines, and block German escape routes. They appeared suddenly, unexpectedly, and often long before German units realized how deeply the Allies had penetrated their rear areas. This constant mobility didn't just win battles, it broke German morale. Soldiers on the Eastern Front were used to facing vast Soviet numbers. But what shook them in the West was how efficiently the Americans used smaller units to create constant pressure. The jeep made that possible. It turned every stretch of road, and every stretch of ground that wasn't even a road, into a potential path for American movement. German troops would retreat at night, believing they had gained distance, only to wake up and find jeep patrols already ahead of them, cutting off bridges or securing villages. It created the sense that the Americans were everywhere at once. Even in the final days, when Germany's supply situation had collapsed and fuel was almost gone, the jeep kept working at full pace. It didn't need premium gasoline. It didn't need teams of mechanics. It didn't need specialized parts. A few tools, a bit of fuel, and 2 hands were enough to keep it running. And in the chaos of collapsing German defenses, that simplicity became a decisive advantage. It was the last thing many German soldiers saw as they surrendered, a small, dusty, battle-worn jeep rolling up with an American officer ready to take control of yet another broken position. As the war drew closer to its conclusion, the jeep's role shifted once again, becoming even more strategic than tactical. At this stage, the American military was not just fighting battles, it was coordinating massive movements of men, equipment, and supplies across territories that had been destroyed by years of conflict. Roads were broken, bridges collapsed, and entire cities were reduced to rubble. Yet the army had to keep pushing forward, keep chasing retreating German forces, and keep stabilizing the areas they liberated. And through all of this, the jeep became the quiet engine of order in a world falling apart. One of the biggest challenges in 1945 was communication. Telephone lines were down, radio towers destroyed, and German sabotage teams constantly targeted supply routes. The jeep stepped into this chaos as the fastest and most reliable method of establishing contact. Wire-laying crews rode on jeeps, unspooling communication line across fields, forests, and shattered roadways. Commanders moved between units as quickly as if they were traveling within a small city, not a war zone. This meant American forces could coordinate artillery support, redirect armor, reposition infantry, and respond to emergencies with a level of precision the Germans could no longer match. Another major responsibility at this stage was securing captured territory. As German forces retreated, they left behind pockets of resistance, booby traps, and civilian populations in desperate need of supplies. Jeep patrols became the first to enter many of these towns. They checked for enemy soldiers hiding in buildings, cleared roads, marked mines, and ensured that the main columns could safely advance. In many cases, jeeps escorted supply trucks carrying food and medical aid to civilians who had not seen relief in months. Soldiers would arrive in a jeep, assess the situation, and coordinate with Allied relief teams. It was frontline work, but not all of it was combat, much of it was humanitarian. In these final months, the jeep also became the preferred vehicle for intelligence teams. Whether it was collecting documents from abandoned German command posts or transporting interpreters to interrogate prisoners, the jeep allowed intelligence officers to move quickly and discreetly. This rapid information flow gave the Allies insight into German troop movements, remaining fuel reserves, and final defensive plans. It helped prevent ambushes, reduced casualties, and accelerated the collapse of German resistance. Meanwhile, the German army, short on fuel, paralyzed by logistics, and unable to maneuver, watched American mobility with disbelief. Their own vehicles sat abandoned on roadsides because they had no fuel to run them. Their command posts were blind because their communication lines had been destroyed. Their units were fragmented and isolated, while American forces moved like a single coordinated body. And everywhere they looked, it seemed a jeep was involved, scouting, communicating, transporting, supplying. By this stage of the war, the jeep had become not just a symbol of American mobility, but a symbol of inevitability. To German soldiers, it represented the constant pressure they could no longer escape, the small but relentless machine that carried the war forward every single day. By the final phase of the war, the jeep had taken on yet another unexpected role, one that went beyond strategy, beyond logistics, and even beyond combat. It became the vehicle that connected the warfront to the human realities of liberation, surrender, and rebuilding. Wherever American forces entered a newly freed town or village, the first thing people usually saw was a dusty jeep rolling in, its engine humming quietly, its driver scanning the streets. For civilians who had lived for years under occupation, bombardment, and brutality, the sight of that little machine meant the end of fear and the beginning of something new. Soldiers arriving in jeeps were often the first to bring food, water, and reassurance. Children ran toward them, elderly villagers waved from broken doorways, and entire communities gathered just to touch the vehicle that symbolized hope. But even as these scenes unfolded, the jeep was also doing crucial military work. Surrender negotiations in many towns were carried out by officers who arrived in jeeps, traveling quickly from unit to unit to ensure German forces laid down their weapons without unnecessary bloodshed. Military police used jeeps to secure streets, enforce curfews, direct traffic, and prevent looting as the chaos of collapsing German authority gave way to Allied control. In many places, the jeep became the first mobile command post, parked at crossroads or town squares where officers coordinated incoming troops, evacuated wounded civilians, and organized local leaders to restore stability. The jeep's importance became even more evident when dealing with displaced persons, thousands of civilians and freed prisoners wandering across destroyed highways in search of safety. American troops used jeeps to scout refugee flows, direct them to processing centers, and deliver urgent assistance to those who were too weak to move. Many survivors of concentration camps first encountered Allied forces through jeep patrols. These patrols flagged down medical convoys, reported dire conditions, and guided relief units to hidden or abandoned facilities. It was one of the most sobering and human roles the jeep ever played. At the same time, American combat units were still advancing, still fighting pockets of German resistance that refused to surrender. Jeep-mounted reconnaissance teams continued to sweep ahead, identifying ambushes, snipers, and roadblocks. Engineers in jeeps guided tank columns around destroyed bridges. Artillery observers kept climbing hills in their little vehicles to maintain accurate fire support. Even in the last days, the jeep remained the nerve system of the advancing Allied force, always moving, always carrying someone essential to the mission. For German soldiers watching the end unfold, the jeep had become something more than a military tool. It was a symbol of a machine they could never stop. It represented an army that never stalled, never lost contact, never ran out of ways to move forward. German officers later admitted that even when they held the high ground or controlled the roads, the Americans always seemed to find a way around, and more often than not, that way involved a jeep. In the final moments of the European war, when white flags appeared from shattered windows and soldiers laid down their weapons, it was often a jeep that rolled up first to receive the surrender. A small, simple vehicle, yet it carried the weight of an entire army's success. As the Allies secured Germany and the fighting drew to a close in May 1945, the jeep transitioned once more from a frontline tool to a symbol of logistical dominance and post-war occupation. Thousands of jeeps moved through ruined cities, carrying occupation forces into towns where German soldiers had surrendered or simply vanished. soldiers discovered captured American vehicles that had been repainted with German markings, modified for armor, or even converted into ad hoc weapons platforms. In some places, jeeps were still running perfectly, while in others, they were battered, fueled with contaminated gasoline, and patched together with makeshift parts. Even in this state, they proved functional enough to serve the occupiers. American troops realized quickly that the jeep's presence wasn't just convenient, it was essential. It allowed rapid movement of officers, military police, engineers, and logistics personnel across territories still unstable and dangerous. The discovery of German attempts to replicate the Jeep after the war revealed how highly the vehicle was valued by even the enemy. Engineers at Volkswagen had been tasked with creating a German equivalent, a four-wheel drive version of the Kubelwagen capable of matching the Jeep's raw performance. Prototypes were constructed, tested, and reportedly performed well, but by the time these vehicles were ready, Germany's industrial capacity had collapsed under Allied bombing, leaving the project incomplete. The fact that they attempted such a program demonstrated clearly how much German military planners had admired the Jeep. It wasn't simply its power or speed, it was the philosophy behind it, a small, versatile, robust, easy-to-maintain vehicle that could be used for almost any task in any environment. Even after the war, the Jeep continued to influence military and civilian vehicle design worldwide. Countries like France, Italy, and Japan looked closely at the Jeep when developing their own post-war utility vehicles. The Soviet Union, which had received thousands of Jeeps through Lend-Lease, studied the vehicles carefully and used lessons learned to produce the GAZ-67, which served throughout the Cold War. In Germany, American occupation forces left behind Jeeps that became part of the rebuilding process, influencing designs for future Bundeswehr vehicles. The basic Jeep concept, lightweight, reliable, versatile, and mass-producible, became a model for decades to come. American soldiers, meanwhile, transitioned the Jeep into peacetime uses almost immediately. Civilian versions were manufactured in 1945 as the WWII, essentially a military Jeep stripped of combat equipment, and it quickly became a favorite for farmers, ranchers, and industrial workers who needed a vehicle capable of handling rough terrain and heavy loads. In many ways, the Jeep's post-war success mirrored its wartime success, practical, dependable, and widely available. Its small size belied its impact, just as during the war, it carried men, supplies, and communications, but now it carried families, tools, and the promise of rebuilding. The legacy of the Jeep extended far beyond its physical presence on battlefields. It represented American industrial might, logistical efficiency, and the practical application of engineering for mass production. Soldiers remembered it as more than a vehicle, it was a tool that saved lives, accelerated operations, and became inseparable from the concept of mobility itself. Even in victory, it continued to move, to serve, and to inspire, a humble machine that had quietly reshaped the way wars were fought and how armies moved. By the end of the war, the Jeep had achieved a level of ubiquity and significance few military vehicles had ever reached. On every front, in every theater of operations, it was there, carrying soldiers across deserts, jungles, mud, and snow, ferrying wounded men to safety, delivering supplies to the front lines, towing small artillery pieces, carrying officers who needed to make decisions in minutes rather than hours. The vehicle itself was simple, unassuming, and in many ways ordinary, but it represented something extraordinary, the American ability to sustain constant mobility, logistics, and operational flexibility at a scale the Germans simply could not match. Captured German reports repeatedly emphasized this point. Soldiers and officers alike marveled at the Jeep's resilience and versatility. When Germans captured a Jeep, they quickly recognized its superiority to their own light vehicles, yet even dozens of captured Jeeps could not replicate the scale or speed of American operations. The numbers were staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, over 640,000 Jeeps had been produced, each costing $649 at the time, and they were deployed across every major battle. The German army, by contrast, struggled to maintain a few dozen in operational condition despite concerted efforts. The Jeep became the tangible symbol of American industrial and logistical advantage, small, mobile, and seemingly limitless in quantity. During operations like the Battle of the Bulge, German planners tried to exploit captured jeeps for deception missions, but the strategy repeatedly failed. They underestimated the number of real American vehicles, the discipline of American forces, and the difficulty of sustaining captured vehicles under constant combat and fuel shortages. Even when German units drove captured jeeps, the sheer presence of thousands of genuine American jeeps on the roads rendered their efforts almost meaningless. The Americans moved faster, responded quicker, and never lacked the resources to replace broken vehicles. It was a lesson in the futility of trying to match an opponent who could not be materially exhausted. After Germany's surrender, occupation forces found thousands of jeeps that had been captured, repainted, or modified by German troops. Some were still in good condition, others heavily worn. Engineers and historians noted attempts by the Germans to reverse engineer the jeep late in the war, but the program was never completed. The industrial collapse of Germany, combined with the Allied advance, made production impossible. Yet the very attempt underscored the respect and admiration even enemy forces had for the jeep. It was not simply a vehicle, it was a paradigm of mobility, simplicity, versatility, and durability, qualities that would influence vehicle design worldwide for decades. The jeep's impact extended beyond military campaigns. Civilians, engineers, and governments around the world adopted its design philosophy. Post-war vehicles in France, Italy, Japan, and the Soviet Union borrowed heavily from the jeep's concepts, proving that its influence transcended wartime necessity. For American troops, it remained a reliable companion, a symbol of mobility and adaptability that had carried them through the most challenging terrains and scenarios. In the narrative of the Second World War, the jeep stood out not as a weapon of destruction, but as a vehicle that enabled an army to move, communicate, fight, and survive, an unremarkable machine that quietly became indispensable, shaping both victory and the future of military and civilian vehicle design. Even after the war, the jeep continued to define the idea of mobility for military and civilian users alike. Its influence on post-war vehicle design was immediate and profound. The United States quickly transitioned military jeeps into civilian life with the WWII, essentially a combat-ready machine stripped of its tactical gear. Farmers, ranchers, and industrial workers embraced it instantly, recognizing its unmatched ability to traverse rough terrain, carry heavy loads, and endure harsh conditions. The jeep became more than a tool, it became a symbol of freedom, reliability, and independence. Its wartime lessons in utility, versatility, and mass production carried over seamlessly into peacetime applications, shaping how people imagined and used vehicles in daily life. In Europe, the jeep left an equally lasting impression. Countries like France, Italy, and Japan closely studied the vehicle, producing civilian and military variants inspired directly by its design. The Soviet Union, having received thousands of jeeps through Lend-Lease, adapted its engineering principles for the GAZ-67, which would serve across the Cold War. Even Germany, recovering from the devastation of war, incorporated lessons from the jeep into new tactical and civilian vehicles, acknowledging the ingenuity of a design that had been so simple yet so effective. Across the world, engineers understood that the genius of the jeep was not in complexity or raw firepower, but in its universality, robustness, and the ease with which it could be repaired, maintained, and reproduced in massive numbers. For the soldiers who had served in the war, the jeep was a constant companion. It carried infantry officers through battlefields, evacuated the wounded from front lines, delivered supplies under fire, and provided rapid communication between units. Its reliability in deserts, forests, mud, and snow made it indispensable. Troops remembered it as more than metal and wheels, it was the enabler of American tactical flexibility. The countless operations it supported, the hours it saved, and the lives it helped preserve were never fully quantified, but its contribution to the Allied victory was undeniable. The legacy of the jeep extended beyond the battlefields. It represented a new way of thinking about war, mobility, and logistics. Industrial might combined with simplicity, versatility, and mass production could overcome even the most disciplined and technically proficient enemy. The Jeep's presence illustrated the concept that victory was as much about moving men and material efficiently as it was about superior firepower. In this way, it became emblematic of the larger American war strategy: overwhelming resources, superior logistics, and adaptability. By the time the post-war world settled into Reconstruction, the Jeep had transcended its role as a mere vehicle. It had become a symbol of endurance, ingenuity, and practical innovation. Soldiers, engineers, and civilians alike recognized its value, and its principles continued to influence vehicle design for decades. From the deserts of North Africa to the roads of Europe, the jungles of the Pacific, and the snow of the Ardennes, the Jeep had proven itself not by one decisive moment, but through consistent, reliable performance. It was unremarkable in appearance, yet extraordinary in impact, a small machine that had quietly shaped the outcome of a global conflict and left a legacy that endured long after the guns fell silent. The story of the Jeep did not end with the war or its transition into civilian life. In many ways, it only grew more significant in the years that followed. As armies around the world rebuilt and restructured, the lessons of World War II remained clear: mobility, flexibility, and reliability were just as crucial as firepower. The Jeep became the benchmark for light tactical vehicles, inspiring generations of designers to prioritize simplicity and versatility over specialized complexity. Even as technology advanced, the basic principles of the Jeep endured: four-wheel drive, robust suspension, easily maintained engines, and a design that could perform countless roles without being tied to a single function. For the United States Army, the Jeep remained a critical component in Korea, adapting to new terrains and climates while maintaining the same dependable performance that had defined it during World War II. Officers and enlisted soldiers alike trusted the Jeep to move them quickly, keep communications open, and deliver supplies to forward positions. It was no longer just a symbol of American industrial power, it was a practical tool that shaped tactics and strategy. Commanders understood that a small, fast, versatile vehicle could often achieve objectives that larger vehicles or specialized units could not, bridging the gap between infantry and armor in a way few other machines could. Meanwhile, civilians continued to adopt the Jeep in unprecedented numbers. Farmers, construction workers, explorers, and adventurers found it ideal for remote locations, harsh conditions, and heavy workloads. Its influence on popular culture became as tangible as its influence on warfare, symbolizing freedom, self-reliance, and capability. For many, the Jeep was no longer a war machine, it was a companion, a tool, and a symbol of resilience. Its ruggedness and adaptability meant it could be used for work, recreation, or travel, effectively turning a military necessity into a civilian icon. Globally, the impact of the Jeep was mirrored in local military adaptations. European nations integrated Jeep-inspired vehicles into their armed forces. Japan and Italy produced vehicles that borrowed heavily from the Jeep's engineering, and the Soviet GAZ-67 proved the practicality of adopting core design principles even under a completely different industrial system. In Germany, post-war military planners acknowledged the Jeep's effectiveness, building light vehicles that mirrored its core philosophy. Across continents and ideologies, the Jeep became a standard for what a light tactical vehicle could achieve, setting the stage for decades of design evolution. Ultimately, the Jeep's true significance lies not in its engine, wheels, or suspension, but in what it represented: a shift in the understanding of warfare and logistics. It demonstrated that a well-designed, versatile, and widely available vehicle could change the outcome of conflicts by enabling rapid movement, efficient communication, and operational flexibility. It showed that industrial capacity, when combined with smart design, could turn a simple vehicle into a force multiplier. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Europe and the mountains of Korea, the Jeep proved that the smallest components of an army, if used intelligently, could have an outsized impact on the course of history. Its legacy remains, not just in military history, but in the very concept of mobility itself, a quiet testament to the power of practicality, versatility, and relentless innovation. Even decades after its first deployment, the Jeep continued to embody the principles that had made it indispensable during World War II. Its reputation was not built on firepower or armor, but on dependability, adaptability, and sheer ubiquity. Soldiers remembered the Jeep not as a flashy weapon, but as the vehicle that made everything else possible. It carried commanders to the front lines, delivered ammunition to artillery units, evacuated wounded soldiers, and provided the infrastructure of mobility that allowed large-scale operations to succeed. In North Africa, Europe, the Pacific, and beyond, the Jeep's contribution was subtle yet profound. It ensured that decisions could be executed, supply chains could function, and units could remain coordinated across vast and chaotic battlefields. The influence of the Jeep extended far beyond the battlefield. After World War II, the global civilian market embraced the vehicle for its ruggedness and versatility. Farmers used it to traverse rocky terrain, ranchers relied on it to transport livestock or supplies, and construction crews found it perfect for moving tools and personnel across uneven sites. Its simple, accessible engineering meant that maintenance could be performed with minimal training and basic tools, making it a practical choice for communities with limited mechanical resources. The civilian CJ-2A became the template for generations of off-road and utility vehicles, cementing the Jeep's place not only in military history but also in everyday life. The Jeep's design principles influenced militaries worldwide. Countries that had faced American forces or received Lend-Lease vehicles, such as France, Japan, Italy, and the Soviet Union, incorporated its lessons into their own post-war vehicle development. Even Germany, once an enemy, adopted similar design philosophies for its light tactical vehicles in the 1950s, acknowledging the superiority of the Jeep's versatility and production efficiency. Its influence persisted across borders and ideologies, proving that good engineering and pragmatic design could transcend national lines and shape global military thought. Perhaps most importantly, the Jeep symbolized the broader American approach to warfare, the combination of industrial capacity, logistics, and operational flexibility. It demonstrated that success in modern conflict relied not just on the skill of individual soldiers or the firepower of tanks, but on the ability to move forces, supplies, and information quickly and reliably. Where the Germans and other opponents often struggled with limited resources, the Americans could field overwhelming numbers of vehicles, ensuring that even when losses occurred, replacements were always available. The Jeep epitomized this principle, a small, simple machine that represented an unstoppable logistical advantage. By the mid-20th century, the Jeep had become more than a military tool or civilian utility vehicle. It was an icon of resilience, versatility, and practicality. It represented a fundamental shift in thinking about vehicles, mobility, and warfare, proving that a modest, well-designed machine could have an outsized impact on both combat and civilian life. Its legacy endures, not just in the vehicles that followed, but in the understanding that the simplest, most adaptable tools are often the ones that shape history the most. From the deserts of Tunisia to the streets of post-war Europe, the Jeep's quiet dominance told a story of industrial strength, logistical genius, and human ingenuity that continues to resonate decades later. As the world moved further into the post-war era, the Jeep's legacy became increasingly apparent in both military doctrine and civilian life. Armies realized that the principles of light, versatile vehicles could shape operations in ways heavy tanks and armored vehicles could not. The Jeep was more than a tool, it was a force multiplier, enabling rapid reconnaissance, quick troop movements, and flexible supply lines that allowed commanders to adapt to changing battle conditions. In theaters like Korea, the Jeep proved that even decades after its initial deployment, its combination of durability, simplicity, and mobility remained unmatched. Officers relied on it to shuttle between units, inspect front lines, and maintain the cohesion of dispersed forces. Its ability to handle harsh terrain, climb steep inclines, ford rivers, and continue operating despite minimal maintenance made it indispensable wherever soldiers needed mobility without the encumbrance of heavy vehicles. Meanwhile, civilians continued to adopt the Jeep as an essential part of post-war reconstruction and economic growth. In rural communities, it became the vehicle of choice for farmers navigating difficult terrain, transporting produce, or towing small trailers. In urban centers, it was prized by construction and utility crews who required a small, reliable vehicle capable of navigating crowded streets while carrying tools and personnel. The design's simplicity meant that repairs could often be carried out in the field, without specialized equipment, which further contributed to its widespread adoption. This transition from a military necessity to a civilian workhorse illustrated the universality of the Jeep's design philosophy. It could serve almost any function with minimal modification. Globally, the Jeep's influence reshaped vehicle design and military thinking. Nations like France, Japan, Italy, and the Soviet Union produced vehicles directly inspired by the Jeep's engineering. Even Germany, during its post-war rearmament, looked to the Jeep as a model for light tactical vehicles. The vehicle's success demonstrated that versatility, robustness, and ease of maintenance were just as critical as raw power or armor in modern military strategy. Its mass production during the war, combined with the ability to operate in virtually every environment, became a template for future military logistics and procurement strategies.